Today's podcast is on everything to do with training your core and midsection. I made a post a couple of weeks ago, and again, I had some really good interaction with people just around it, because training the core is something about 10 years ago was really fashionable. And people were doing a lot of like crunch variations and different style of core drills to essentially get a six pack or to strengthen up your midsection. Then there was a big counter movement where people actually moved away from training core, and they're like, if you do the big compound movements, you do not need to train your core. Now, this thinking is very flawed. My stance on everything is context matters 100% of the time. And I think depending on what you do, depending on how you train, depending on your body type, your strategy is going to be slightly different to the person next to you, for instance. One thing to think about though is your midsection is like any other area of the body, is a group of muscles that need to be trained in isolation. They need to be trained in groups, and then they need to be trained in function. And the midsection itself is essentially an active area. If you think about it, the only passive support of the midsection is the back, the spine. So everything around the front is, you have the ability to contract and hold position. So I've never really understood why people have said, oh, don't train your core. Because to me, that just sounds like, it sounds like you're missing out on a huge piece of the training puzzle. Now, how much training effort you dedicate it to it, and, you know, depending on how you train, sure, there's going to be variance, but just excluding the core altogether and the midsection altogether just honestly isn't that logical of a rationale to not have it in there. Now, I'm going to break out today why I think so, but a way to like look at training. I think part of this whole situation is people just don't really understand how to train it that well. Like anything, if you want to train your biceps or your quad over time, you need to have different ways to train it. You're not going to train the same exercise year round. There's going to be similarities between it, but you still need to have progressive in nature. And I think that is the issue with this here, is people have gotten great success without training their core, for instance. But, you know, behind a lens, they might look like they have a really great physique. They've worked really hard on their diet. They might have that great, you know, six pack or eight pack that you're looking for, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're functioning well. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have back pain or hip pain, or that their training could actually be enhanced by adding core stuff in there. Now, when we have a look at the midsection itself, there's a couple of different ways that you can sort of break it down. If you have a look at it in its simplistic form, it's connecting your rib cage to your pelvis. Very, very simple, but there's different groups of muscles in there that have different actions and they pull you in different directions. So as with anything, like let's just relate this to a bicep for a second. If I wanted to get a peak contraction of my bicep, I'm going to bring my arm out in front of me and I'm really going to bunch up that tissue there. If I wanted to train my bicep from a lengthened position, I could lay back on an incline bench and get that really nice big stretch through the long head of my bicep. The same is true with your midsection. We need to break it down into categories and look at it like simplistically in isolation, and then how we can progress it so it works together. So the first way that I would look at midsection is look at the sagittal plane, flexion, extension, front and back, the simplistic way. Little crunches, little extensions, and variants. I'm going to run through some exercises in a second, but also linking in hip extension and hip flexion, because your pelvis is working with your midsection. They all need to coordinate together. So phase one of any core-based training program could essentially just be in isolation, working flexion and extension. Now, I have some drills that essentially here would be very helpful. So if you looked at your core, direct crunch work and its variations, whether that's a band curl up, a half a sit up, doing an isometric hold in a crunch position, is something that's getting the shortening of the tissue, it's a contraction of the tissue into flexion. And then the opposite is true. Doing something like a seated good morning or a back extension is going to directly train your extension muscles at the lower back. Now, that is just training front to back. Now, anything with a psoas march, so pulling your knee up towards your chest and training hip flexion is really, really beneficial. And any sort of bent knee glute bridge is super beneficial because you're training in isolation all the flexion components and all the extension components. Now, that is a logical phase one. A phase two, then we need to start to think about moving side to side. So looking at the frontal plane. So tied into this, we've got our obliques. We've got our adductors, we've got our glute med and hip stabilizing muscles. So in a phase like this, we would want to start to train ourselves to be less fragile in just the front to back motion and move side to side. So anything that's a hip abduction, like a cable abduction, a side plank where you're laying on the ground with a straight body, so that bottom hip's working really hard and you're keeping yourself nice and stacked, a Copenhagen plank, an adductor plank on the actual ground, something working the inner thigh itself. So you're working the outside and the inside of the actual hip itself. But then when we look at the midsection, we can work it and train different variants. Where a side plank, we could do a side plank GHD hold where we're basically resisting that position. We could do a lateral bend. There are so many exercises here, but phase one, front to back. Phase two, side to side. Then what we want to start to do is start to load these positions so they mimic or they're a little bit more specific to the types of forces that we're doing in training. So if we just think of a deadlift as such, we're training a huge amount of extension. We're using our extensors, we're using our glutes, our hamstrings, everything on the backside. So on the front side of things, the first level could be something like a plank. We're directly training the opposite, but we want to make that a little bit harder. We want variations of core work in there that would actually then start to stimulate things a little bit more. So this is when we can lead into either like a kneeling cable crunch. On a GHD, you could do a reverse plank where you're looking up to the roof and you're holding all that tension through your midsection. You could do that holding a weight, and you can also do that into the sit-up range of movement. So you're starting to train the opposing muscle groups that you were training in a deadlift. This is a super logical way of looking at things here. Now, when we have a look at the extensors as well, you know, we do definitely get a lot of tension through our back, like through our upper back, through our mid back deadlifting, but sometimes the lower back is actually quite weak as well. So we can add in variants of back extensions that also target the lower back. So something like a snatch grip back extension, which really targets that lower form of the erectors, and then also pair that with a GHD sit-up. So we're hitting both ends of front to back. Now, if we have a look at this side to side, I was saying before, a little bit more of a frontal plane movement. We can actually start to move into the frontal plane a little bit purely by doing some lateral lunges or resisting the frontal plane. By doing, like I spoke about before, you could do a plank hold in a lateral line, like on the side, or you could actually set up a pull-off press with a cable down low and hold the pull-off press up above head. So now you're resisting and having to do that lateral flexion away from the anchor point of the weight. So now we've got our body in a position where we're good front to back, we're good side to side. We've done it in isolation. We've started to incorporate it in together a little bit more. Now we need to make this carry over into functional type of activities and movements. Now, this is where loaded carries comes into it. So walking like a suitcase carry, one heavy kettlebell in your hand where you're having to resist rotation. You could also do variants of that. You could hold one on your chest and one beside your body, where now we're starting to get some rotation whilst we're walking in a straight line. A kettlebell windmill is an exercise where you hold a kettlebell up above head and you've got all this shoulder stability going on, but you're shifting weight into your hip. So you're stretching out one side of your hip, but you're also loading it eccentrically. So now what we've done is we've used the isolated stuff front to back, side to side, and now we're incorporating it into loaded movements, which challenge the whole system. Now, when we start to look at core training like this, it starts to make a bit more sense. And in the post that I made about core training, you can actually pair this up really, really well with your training programs. Now, if you had a look at your training phase, for instance, if I was, taking someone onto the gym and say they had a little bit of training background, I could start them off on isolated base movements. Really good, get good mind-muscle connection, work on functional stability and control, and then I can move that into something, say more unilateral focused. And I could work on, split squats, single arm dumbbell presses, variants like that. Then I could move that into, say, compound movements where it's really machine focused, and then I could move into big bang for your buck barbell stuff, right? And push a bit more strength. Now, if you aligned your core training alongside your actual training progression as well, it now starts to make a little bit more sense. We're starting to look at training where we're training everything in isolation and combined over a period of a year time. Now, this here is actually the key to training enjoyment, variety in training, and also the cool thing about it is this is such a preventative tool for pain. Like if your system works great in isolation and together, this is one of those things that your mind-muscle connection gets better, your movements get better, your output gets better. Everything improves when your whole body works in a system together. But in order to do that, in order to make that happen, you have to be able to control the individual parts. Now, if we move into the second point, which is breathing and bracing. Now, breathing and bracing, I'm not going to get into the nuances of that, but a huge part of breathing and bracing is actually being able to control your obliques, your rectus abdominis, and the core muscles in general. So if you as a lifter have the ability to get a better mind-muscle connection actually with your midsection, you're going to be able to create more tension there. Then if you're effective at breathing, you're going to be able to get air in and create a really sound brace. Now, if I said to you, if I hear the cue or the phrase, brace as if you're about to get punched in the stomach one more time, I'm probably going to slap myself in the face because it's so short-sighted. Like if you're just tense, it kind of doesn't really make sense. The whole point of creating tension at the front of your midsection is to get alignment of your rib cage and your pelvis. It's to pull them together so you can create a stiff exterior shell that you can breathe into. It's a pressure chamber, but it's very short-sighted, just getting tight. We need to be able to pull the ribs down. We need to tuck the pelvis under, and then from there, we need to be able to breathe. But the key of this is if you can train your core in isolation, you're going to be able to get a better mind-muscle connection with your obliques, which are key here. You're going to get a better mind-muscle connection with your actual rectus abdominis, which is super key here. Then your breathing and bracing gets better, which means your training technique gets better, your position gets better, and everything in terms of a prehab pain standpoint improves. So when we look at core training, one part is, yes, the direct mind-muscle connection. Yes, it's treating your body as a whole. But two, it actually makes your big lifts better. Like I'm done with hearing that core training doesn't have a carryover into like your lifting, because it does. That is like old-fashioned news. We need to move on from that. I'm done with that. I never want to hear it again. And the whole point of today's podcast is to try and provide a little bit of logic around it and show you how a very logical framework can, pan out across a year time. Now, the midsection, just to reiterate this point, is completely controlled by active tension, muscle mass. So why would you not train your midsection? It just does not make sense. You need to be training it in a progressive manner over time. And like anything, you're going to push it up and pull it back down, push it up and pull it back down. But that's the whole point of training. You're not reinventing the wheel every training program. You're getting good at something, progressing it. Then there might be another exercise that does the similar thing and you progress through that. That's the whole point of training, progressive, structured training. The core is no different. And look, I can tell you right now, like I'm 36. Up until 30, I had no injuries, none. I was bulletproof. I could come in if I needed to. I didn't even need to warm up. When you start to become a seasoned lifter, you're strong, you've built a great amount of muscle mass, you need to be doing work that keeps your system communicating. You can't rely on the hope that you're going to be feeling good. You need to prep your body in a way that it works together so you're not putting unnecessary stress on areas, you're not overloading certain areas, and you put yourself in a position where you can be most effective in the gym. Like from a prehab standpoint, you need to train your a call. Now, I hope that message hits home today. If you guys have any question, feel free to reach out to me. And that's it for today's episode. I'll see you guys on the next one.